has a reverse side too. And one of the things that we've heard in recent years is the question, isn't this over yet? Isn't the war finished? Do we have to still go through this? So I think it's important, as we honor the victims of 9/11, to address that question very directly. Because if we get the answer wrong, there will be more 9/11s in our future. And so as we look at this question, I think the first thing we have to ask is, as a nation, have we become too complacent? Because ultimately, the answer to the question about America's safety rests with us. More than anything else, it's a question about our attitudes. And if we're honest about it, we will see that some of our fellow citizens have become complacent. Part of it's just human nature. 10 years is a long time. Part of it is forgetfulness. That's just part of human nature too. But there are other parts of it that are a little more troubling. And I have to say, this morning I saw an example of the most troubling kind. And I was so outraged when I read this that I almost thought, I'll give this a pass, but I just think it's too important to let it go by, because it illustrates, in my mind, the problem we still have at home. I'll get to the problems internationally in a minute. But this morning, Paul Krugman, a columnist for the New York Times, a professor at Princeton University, a Nobel Prize winner for economics. I don't know how else you define establishment other than by those criteria. In his blog, The Conscience of a Liberal, looked at 9/11. And this is what he said. He said, what happened after 9/11, and I think even people on the right know this, whether they admit it or not, was deeply shameful. He attacked what he called fake heroes, like President Bush and Mayor Giuliani, who, in his words, he said, raced to cash in on the horror. He then said, the memory of referring to what happened after 9/11, he said, the memory of 9/11 has been irrevocably poisoned. It has become an occasion for shame. And in its heart, the nation knows it. Now, it is so twisted for anyone, let alone an American citizen, to say those things, that, as I say, it passed my mind that I just ought to let it go rather than read it. But I think you can understand now why I decided it was important to bring it to your attention. Because this is a view of someone deep in the heart of the American establishment, not some foreigner who doesn't care about our country, but one of our fellow citizens. And however outrageous those views, we can assume that many others share them. Many on his newspaper, many in our schools and universities, many in the mainstream media, and many in governmental institutions and the government complex in Washington. Now, not all of them share the views in exactly the way he put them, I hope. They probably shades of difference. But there are people in this country who believe that we are at fault for responding to 9/11 the way that we did. So the next time the thought crosses your mind, as it crosses all of our minds, why is this burden placed on us? Why are our responsibilities so great? Think about the attitude of people like Paul Krugman, who deny us the right to defend ourselves. And when we see it in our own country, I think we have an understanding of, a better understanding of the nature of the threat we face. because those who wish us ill internationally think exactly the same thing. And they are not waiting for us to get our economic house in order. They are challenging us today. Now, we ask beyond our own complacency, are we safer today than we were on 9/11? And, you know, there's no simple answer to that question. In some respects we are, in some respects we're not. There are more variables in play than just the world as it was on September the 11th, followed by the attacks, followed by our response. A lot of factors have been moving around the world since then, not all of them in response to what America does. Many forces have been out there, unleashed now, for reasons well beyond our decision to defend ourselves and go after those who attacked us on 9/11. It's not enough simply to say, as some do, that the main branch of al-Qaeda has suffered grievously, that we have killed Osama bin Laden, thank goodness, that we've hampered their abilities in many material respects. That's true. Our military has had amazing success over the past 10 years. We have defeated the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have overthrown Saddam Hussein, one of the worst threats to international peace and security in our lifetime. We've had many other victories as well. But that's not the end of it, unfortunately, because of these forces that have been unleashed in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. And that's why I think it is possible to say two things at the same time. We have scored enormous victories, but we are not yet fully safe. That's why shortly after 9/11, President Bush talked about the war against terrorism being a long war. It had to be a long war. It's a different kind of war than we've fought before, not just against the terrorists, but against their state sponsors as well, and not just those who overtly sponsor terrorism, but those who assisted in more indirect ways. And there are many of those as well. We have experience in long wars. We had a long war against communism. And many people in this country and around the world didn't have the stomach for that either. They didn't want to take the time and spend the resources that were necessary. But ultimately we triumphed, and we will triumph over this threat as well, as long as we can maintain our resolve. So it's the requirement is that we live in a world of ambiguity, that we can have victories, but we cannot be totally safe, because in fact, we're never going to be totally safe. Not as long as we are who we are. History is not going to end. We may wish it would, but it's not going to. And that is the responsibility that we have. Now, we have made several critical decisions in the last 10 years that I think have been important to understanding how to deal with the threats against the United States. And the most important decision, I think, was one made literally in the days and weeks after the 9/11 attacks, to understand what happened to us as an act of war, as an unprovoked act of aggression against the United States. We rejected the metaphor that had dominated our thinking before, that terrorism was a law enforcement matter, that you could deal with terrorism by apprehending the perpetrators, prosecuting them, and punishing them by jail sentences or otherwise. That metaphor doesn't begin to capture the nature of the threat against the United States around the world. By understanding it as an act of war, we were able to marshal all of our forces, all of our constitutional authority to defend ourselves. The attacks of 9/11 were not big bank robberies. They were acts of war. And that decision made by President Bush very early on is something that was intensely criticized by the likes of Paul Krugman and others over the last 10 years, talking about due process for the terrorists, for the people who killed 3,000 Americans and people from all around the world on 9/11, as if on the battlefield in Afghanistan we were supposed to stop and read them their Miranda rights and give them a right to counsel and act like there was ever going to be the possibility of a fair trial. This is something that many of our friends in Europe have still not accepted, to their own peril, I think. But it's something I think now we can say with some confidence that debate has been won in this country. Remember how President Obama was going to close down Guantanamo Bay within 1 year after taking office because we didn't want to hold the terrorist indefinitely? Guantanamo Bay is still open, and I'll tell you something, when President Obama leaves office, which I hope will be January the 20th, 1913, Guantanamo Bay will still be open, and it will still have terrorists in it, and it should. And in fact, we've seen our Nobel Peace Prize winning president order more drone attacks against al-Qaeda in Pakistan in 2 years in office than President Bush did in 8 years in office. And I applaud every one of those drone attacks. So that's a success as well. But let's be clear, even though al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been dealt grievous blows, the terror threat and the threat from radical Islam has not been resolved successfully. It has grown, it has metastasized, it has emerged in places where it didn't exist or where we didn't see it visibly on 9/11. And the reason for that is that as we look at what's happened throughout the Middle East recently in the so-called Arab Spring, much of the turmoil that has ensued has come because repressive regimes have been overthrown and things that have been repressed have come to the surface, including radical Islam in places like Egypt and now in Libya. The struggle between the advocates of democracy in Egypt and Syria and Libya and other countries in the region and the advocates of radical Islam, terrorism, is unresolved. And it's going to be a struggle, I think, that will occupy us for quite some time. And it's one that requires continuing diligence because the threat to the United States comes not simply from the violence of those who hold this radical ideology, although that's its most tangible evidence, but from the policies that they will pursue that are adverse to our interests and those of our friends and allies in the region and around the world. So this struggle is one that does have a philosophical and political component as well as a military component, and that it's important that we understand that defending American interest is something that is necessary to lay the predicate for long-term stability. That it's not American strength that's provocative, it's American weakness that's provocative. That you don't advance American interest by apologizing for our country. That doesn't satisfy our adversaries, it emboldens them. It says America has weakened, that our challenges to America are succeeding. So what is the incentive for those who hold that view? To increase the level of challenge. And that's why in the struggles in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is important to continue a strong American presence. It will take a long time. It's not a pleasant subject, but the people that we're fighting there are not pleasant people. And they don't have pleasant interests in mind. So we can either fight them there or we can fight them here. I don't think that's a hard choice. And it's one of the reasons why I think, as a matter of our national public debate, these kinds of issues have to have more saliency. Now, the experts in counterterrorism, many of them will say that the defeats that al-Qaeda have suffered alone show that we're safer. But there are, as I said before, there are things that have changed since 9/11 that should worry us much more than at least worry our contemporary leadership. And the thing that worries me more than anything else, and has for quite some time, is the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, weapons of mass destruction. Not just from the rogue states that have the capability to build these weapons, but the potential that they would give them to terrorist groups. As horrible as 9/11 was, and the number of deaths that were caused, imagine people willing to commit suicide carrying nuclear weapons into lower Manhattan, into the heart of Washington, into any American city. Into any city of a friend or ally of the United States around the world. Or if not nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or biological weapons. These are not points of idle speculation. When we succeeded in overthrowing al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan, we found on al-Qaeda's computers and in their files their objectives to get weapons of mass destruction. It's been part of their ideology from the very beginning. And we've seen just recently press reports about what some deride as a sort of offshoot or a minor subsidiary of al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, making efforts to achieve production of ricin, a pathogen, a biological weapon of incredible power. These are threats that put 9/11 into real perspective, and they are real threats, and they are continuing threats. And it's the threat from the terrorist and from the state sponsors of terrorism. You can pummel al-Qaeda in the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but it's Iran drawing ever closer to nuclear weapons that's the potential source for al-Qaeda or others. It's North Korea, which since 9/11 has exploded 2 nuclear devices. And many experts are now predicting they're close to exploding their 3rd nuclear device, making progress all the time in perfecting the weapons technology, reducing the size of the weapon to fit it onto a ballistic missile warhead. It's the nuclear weapons in Pakistan, also threatened by radical Islamicists, Pakistani Taliban and others, who, if they took control of that country, would not only be able to use it as Taliban used Afghanistan as a base for international terrorism, but would gain control of Pakistan's substantial arsenal of nuclear weapons, publicly estimated at between 60 and 200. North Korea, which for the past 10 years I've been trying to explain to people is a major player in the Middle East. After all, it was a North Korean reactor that Israel destroyed in September of 2007. Where? In Syria. Because Syria and North Korea share a common border? Because of their close cultural history? No, because the rogue states are cooperating among themselves in ballistic missile technology, in nuclear weapons technology, and possibly in chemical and biological weapons technology. This is an axis of evil, as President Bush said. And it's a continuing threat to us and to our friends. I'm very worried that the Obama administration has basically concluded that we're not going to be able to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and that while we don't like that, in their view, they'll say it's okay because we can contain and deter Iran as we contained and deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I think this is badly misguided. I think the mental calculus of the rulers in Tehran is fundamentally different from the Soviet rulers back in the Cold War. But even if I'm wrong about that, even if we could somehow contain and deter the likes of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollahs, it doesn't stop with Iran. If they get nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will, Turkey will, perhaps others in the region, so that in a relatively short period of time, you could see half a dozen or more nuclear weapon states in the Middle East, an inherently unstable situation and an environment that invites the transmission of nuclear weapons to terrorist groups who could strike without attribution. So these are the ways in which the world has grown less safe since 9/11. Not because of our response, but because of things that were going on before 9/11 and have continued after 9/11. And there are other threats beyond that as well. You know, we've talked about terrorism for much of the past 10 years, but great power politics hasn't disappeared. It didn't end with the Cold War. We see a resurgent Russia using its oil and gas revenues to refurbish its nuclear stockpile, to rebuild its ballistic missile capabilities, to renew its conventional warfare capabilities, squeezing the countries of the former Soviet Union to reestablish hegemony there. We see China building a blue water navy for the first time in 1,000 years, with aircraft carriers and submarines making outrageous territorial claims in the South China Sea, trying to exclude American and other naval vessels from international waters close by China, threatening its neighbors, intimidating its neighbors. China doesn't need to be a global peer competitor of the United States to achieve its objectives over the next century. It simply needs to be able to deny the United States control over the Western Pacific that we've exercised since 1945. And this is not just a geostrategic game. This is about protecting our economy. This is about protecting the vital sea lines of communication for us, for Japan, for South Korea, for Australia, for others. These are critical issues that affect us on a day-to-day basis. And you can be sure it's countries like China and Russia that are giving the state sponsors of terrorism, like Iran, North Korea, Syria, and others, that indirect support that's so critical to keeping them going. And we're going to face right here in the next few months, domestically, a very, very important battle over our defense budget. You know, we're all concerned, and we should be, that we want economic recovery. And critical to that is reducing government expenditures, taxation, regulation that are strangling the economy in its efforts to get up off its back. But in the debt ceiling limitation legislation that was agreed to, we have found we were outmaneuvered in a way. And under the system that has been put into this debt ceiling bill, if the Joint Committee, the so-called Super Committee, can't reach agreement on how to reach the debt ceiling targets, a trigger mechanism will come into effect that will cut the defense budget dramatically. Here are the amounts. Obama has already cut $350 billion in his first 2.5 years, while he put through a stimulus package that increased domestic spending by $900 billion. He was cutting $350 billion from defense. The debt ceiling legislation already agrees to another $400 billion of defense cuts, and the trigger mechanism would cut $600 billion more dollars. You're talking close to $1.5 trillion of cuts in defense. And as Secretary Rumsfeld said just the other day, that will leave us defenseless. It will hollow out our military, just at the time that our adversaries are looking for more opportunities to threaten us and our friends and allies around the world. It's why Senator John Kyle of Arizona, one of the members of the Super Committee, said on Thursday of last week that he would resign from the committee before he would ever allow those defense cuts to take place.